The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Royal Academy of Dance in London, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Margaret Thompson adjusted her ballet shoes for the third time, her nerves getting the better of her as she prepared for what was supposed to be a routine intermediate dance class. At 23, she had been dancing for most of her life, but today felt different somehow. The other students chatted quietly among themselves, stretching and warming up at the bar that lined the mirrored walls. There were 12 dancers in total, ranging from teenagers to adults in their 30s, all united by their passion for movement and grace. The studio smelled of rosin and wood polish, familiar scents that usually calmed Margaret's pre-class jitters. Their instructor, Ms. Vivian Clark, was a former principal dancer with the Royal Ballet who commanded respect with every precise movement. She had been teaching at the Academy for over 15 years and was known for her attention to detail and no-nonsense approach. Students would often joke that she could spot a misplaced finger from across the room. As the clock struck 10 ms, Clark entered the studio with her usual brisk pace, her silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. She wore her signature black leotard and wrap skirt, her posture so straight it seemed to defy gravity. The students immediately quieted and took their positions at the bar. "Good morning, class," Miss Clark announced, her voice carrying the authority of decades of experience. "Today we'll be working on our port de bras and focusing on the fluidity of movement between positions. Remember, dance is not just about technique, it's about telling a story with your body." Margaret nodded along with the others, positioning herself third from the front at the bar. She had always struggled with making her movements look effortless, often appearing too mechanical in her execution. Ms. Clark had been working with her for months to help her find that elusive quality that separated good dancers from great ones. The warm-up began with simple plies, the familiar rhythm of classical music filling the room. Margaret focused on her reflection in the mirror, trying to embody the grace that seemed to come so naturally to some of her classmates. Sarah, the girl next to her, moved like water, each transition seamless and beautiful. 20 minutes into the class, they had moved to center floor work, practicing a combination that Ms. Clark had choreographed specifically for their level. The sequence included chasses, pirouettes, and grand jetés that required both technical skill and artistic expression. Margaret was finally beginning to feel the flow that had eluded her for so long when she noticed Ms. Clark's expression change. The instructor's eyes had shifted toward the studio's entrance, her usual composed demeanor showing the slightest crack of surprise. Margaret followed her gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. Standing in the doorway, looking distinctly out of place among the dancers, was a tall, elderly man in a perfectly pressed navy suit. It took Margaret a moment to process what she was seeing. The man's bearing was unmistakably regal, his white hair neatly combed, and his piercing blue eyes surveying the room with obvious curiosity. Behind him stood two men in dark suits who were clearly security personnel, though they tried to blend into the background. Ms. Clark quickly moved toward the unexpected visitor, her professional training kicking in despite the unusual circumstances. The music continued to play, but the dancers had all stopped mid-movement, unsure whether they should continue or acknowledge the distinguished guest who had just entered their sanctuary. "Your Royal Highness," Ms. Clark said with a slight curtsy, her voice betraying only the smallest hint of surprise. "This is indeed an unexpected pleasure. How may we assist you?" The elderly gentleman smiled, an expression that transformed his sometimes stern public demeanor into something far more approachable. Margaret realized she was holding her breath, still frozen in the middle of what had been a perfectly executed arabesque just moments before. "Please, don't let me interrupt your class," Prince Philip said, his voice carrying that distinctive accent that had been familiar to the British public for decades. "I was simply passing by and heard the music. It reminded me of something, and I found myself curious about what goes on in these studios." Margaret exchanged glances with Sarah, both girls trying to process the surreal nature of their situation. Here they were in their practice clothes and, sweaty from exertion, being visited by a member of the royal family as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ms. Clark, ever the professional, gestured toward the group of students who remained frozen in various poses around the studio. "We were just working on a center floor combination, Your Royal Highness. These are some of our intermediate students, all quite dedicated to their craft." Prince Philip nodded approvingly, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed the scene before him. Margaret couldn't help but notice how he seemed to take in every detail of the studio, from the worn spots on the floor where countless dancers had practiced their craft to the inspirational quotes about dance that decorated the walls. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "You know, people often don't realize the physical demands of dance. The strength, the endurance, the sheer determination required." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the group of students. "It's rather like being a royal in some ways." The comment hung in the air, unexpected and intriguing. Margaret found herself leaning forward slightly, despite still maintaining her arabesque position. There was something in the prince's tone that suggested he had more to say, something personal that he was working up to sharing. Miss Clark sensed the same thing. "Would you care to observe for a few minutes, Your Royal Highness? I'm sure the students would be honored to demonstrate some of our work." Prince Philip considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Actually, that sounds quite pleasant. It's been a rather long morning of official engagements, and I must admit, watching something beautiful sounds like exactly what I need." As he moved to stand along the side of the studio, Margaret finally allowed herself to relax from her arabesque, though her muscles protested after holding the position for so long. She couldn't believe this was actually happening. In all her years of dancing, she had never imagined she would perform in front of royalty, especially not during what was supposed to be a regular Tuesday morning class. Miss Clark quickly regrouped, addressing her students with renewed energy. "Class, we have been honored with a visit from His Royal Highness Prince Philip. Let's show him what we've been working on, shall we?" The students nodded eagerly, adrenaline now pumping through their veins in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of dance. Margaret took her position for the beginning of their combination, acutely aware of the royal observer who stood watching with genuine interest. As the music began again, something magical happened. Perhaps it was the presence of their distinguished guest, or maybe it was simply the culmination of months of hard work. But the entire class seemed to elevate their performance to a new level. Margaret found herself moving with a grace she had never achieved before, each step flowing naturally into the next, as if she had finally unlocked the secret that Ms. Clark had been trying to teach her. Prince Philip watched intently, his expression growing more thoughtful with each passing minute. Margaret could see him observing not just their technique, but the effort and passion that went into every movement. There was something in his eyes that suggested he understood, on a deeper level, what it meant to perform under pressure and maintain composure when all eyes were upon you. The combination ended to scattered applause from Prince Philip, who seemed genuinely impressed by what he had witnessed. Margaret felt a flush of pride as she caught her breath, still hardly believing that she had just performed ballet for a member of the royal family. The other students wore similar expressions of amazement and accomplishment. "Quite remarkable," Prince Philip said, stepping forward slightly. "The precision, the athleticism involved. I must say, it's far more demanding than most people realize." He paused, his gaze settling on the group of dancers who stood before him, still glowing from their performance. Miss Clark beamed with pride at her students. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. These young people work incredibly hard. Many of them train 6 days a week, often juggling their dance studies with regular jobs or university courses." Prince Philip nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I can imagine. The dedication required must be immense." He walked closer to the group, his hands still clasped behind his back. "Tell me, how long have each of you been dancing?" Margaret felt her heart race as the prince's attention turned to the students directly. Sarah, ever confident, spoke first. "I've been dancing since I was 4, Your Royal Highness. 17 years now." 17 years, Prince Philip repeated, raising his eyebrows. "And you're how old now?" 21, sir. "So you've spent the majority of your life in pursuit of this art form." He looked genuinely intrigued by this revelation. And the physical demands, they must take quite a toll on your body. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Oh yes, sir. We deal with constant muscle soreness, blisters, occasional injuries. But it's worth every moment of discomfort for the joy of dancing. Prince Philip's expression grew more animated, as if Sarah had touched on something that resonated deeply with him. Ah yes, the constant physical demands. The way your body aches after a long day of performing your duties. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think people might be surprised at how similar our experiences are. Margaret exchanged another glance with Sarah. There was something in the prince's tone that suggested he was building up to something significant, something personal that he wanted to share. Ms. Clark, sensing the shift in mood, gently encouraged the conversation. Your Royal Highness, would you care to elaborate? I'm sure the students would find your perspective fascinating. Prince Philip looked around the room, taking in the mirrors, the bars, the inspirational posters about perseverance and dedication. His gaze lingered on a quote that read, "Dance is the hidden language of the soul." After a long moment, he seemed to come to a decision. He began, his voice taking on a more conversational tone. I've spent over 70 years performing. Not on stage like you, but in a different kind of theater altogether. The theater of public life, of royal duty, of constant scrutiny and expectation. The students listened intently, captivated by this unexpected glimpse into royal life. Margaret found herself hanging on every word, fascinated by the parallel he was drawing between their worlds. People see the ceremonies, the state dinners, the public appearances, and they think it's all glamorous and effortless, rather like how they might watch a ballet performance and not realize the years of training, the physical pain, the mental discipline required to make it look so graceful and natural. He began to pace slowly as he spoke, his movements deliberate and measured. Take this morning, for instance. I had already attended a military parade at 7 o'clock, followed by a meeting with the heads of 3 different charities, then a dedication ceremony for a new hospital wing. Each event required a different aspect of my public persona, much like how you must adapt your technique for different styles of dance. Margaret was struck by how tired Prince Philip looked as he spoke, not physically tired, but emotionally weary in a way that spoke to decades of service and duty. She began to understand why he had wandered into their dance studio, seeking perhaps a moment of respite from his demanding schedule. The military parade, he continued, required me to stand at attention for nearly an hour, reviewing troops in the cold morning air. My back was aching by the end of it, but of course one cannot show discomfort when hundreds of soldiers are demonstrating their dedication and precision. Sarah spoke up gently. That sounds very much like holding a difficult pose during a performance, sir. We learn to smile through the pain. Exactly, Prince Philip exclaimed, his face lighting up with recognition. You understand completely. The show must go on, regardless of how you feel physically or emotionally in that moment. He moved closer to the bar, running his hand along the smooth wood. After the military parade, I had barely 15 minutes to change uniforms and prepare for the charity meeting. 3 different organizations, each with their own urgent needs, their own passionate representatives. I had to be fully present for each conversation, to show genuine interest and concern, even though my mind was still processing the morning's events and anticipating the afternoon schedule. Margaret watched as Prince Philip seemed to lose himself in the memory, his guard dropping completely as he shared this intimate glimpse into his world. She realized that this was probably a very rare moment for him, being able to speak freely about the challenges of his role without worrying about protocol or public perception. The hospital dedication was perhaps the most emotionally demanding, he continued, his voice growing softer. I met with families whose children were being treated for serious illnesses. Their hope, their strength in the face of unimaginable challenges, it was both inspiring and heartbreaking. One must find the right words, the appropriate tone, the perfect balance between empathy and encouragement. Ms. Clark nodded understandingly. Your Royal Highness, it sounds as though you rarely have a moment to simply be yourself, to process your own feelings about these experiences. Prince Philip turned to face her, his expression one of gratitude for her understanding. Precisely. And that's what brought me here, actually. I was walking past, heard the music, and for some reason, I found myself drawn a step inside. Perhaps because dance represents something pure, something that exists simply for the joy and beauty of movement. He looked around at the students again, his eyes settling on each face in turn. You practice and perfect your art because you love it, because it feeds something in your soul. There's no pretense, no hidden agenda, no political implications. Just the honest expression of human movement and emotion. Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat as she listened to this vulnerable confession from a man who had spent his entire adult life in service to his country. She began to see him not as the sometimes stern royal figure she had known from photographs and news reports, but as a human being who, despite all his privileges, carried burdens that she was only beginning to understand. "The truth is," Prince Philip said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's exhausting. Not just the physical demands, though those are significant, but the emotional labor of being constantly on, of always being the person others need you to be, rather than simply being yourself." The studio fell completely silent except for the soft sound of their breathing and the distant traffic outside. Margaret realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a royal visit, but a moment of genuine human connection across the vast differences in their circumstances. The weight of Prince Philip's words hung in the air like morning mist, creating an atmosphere of unexpected intimacy in the dance studio. Margaret could see that her fellow students were as moved as she was by this rare glimpse behind the royal facade. Miss Clark stood with her hands folded, her professional demeanor softened by obvious compassion for their distinguished visitor. "Your Royal Highness," Miss Clark said gently, "would you perhaps like to sit down for a moment? We have a small seating area where parents sometimes observe classes." Prince Philip looked toward the corner where a few simple chairs were arranged, then back at the group of dancers. "Actually, if you don't mind, I think I prefer to stay here among you. There's something about being in a space dedicated to art and expression that feels rather therapeutic." He moved to lean against the bar, a gesture so natural and unguarded that Margaret almost forgot she was in the presence of royalty. The security personnel remained by the door, professional but unobtrusive, allowing their charge this moment of genuine connection. "You mentioned the emotional labor," said James, one of the older students who had been quiet until now. "I think we understand that more than you might expect, sir. When we perform, we're not just executing steps. We're telling stories, conveying emotions that the audience needs to feel, even when those emotions might be quite different from what we're experiencing personally." Prince Philip's eyes widened with interest. "How do you mean?" James stepped forward slightly, his usual shyness overcome by the significance of the moment. "Well, last month I performed in a piece about joy and celebration, but I had just learned that my grandmother was seriously ill. The audience needed to see happiness and energy, so that's what I gave them, even though my heart was breaking." "Yes," Prince Philip said emphatically, straightening up from the bar. "Yes, that's exactly what I mean. The performance must be authentic for the audience, regardless of your personal state. I've opened Parliament while worried sick about family members, attended celebrations while grieving private losses, delivered speeches about hope while feeling quite discouraged myself." Margaret found her voice, surprising herself with her boldness. "Your Royal Highness, how do you find the strength to continue? In dance, we can at least finish a performance, and then collapse in exhaustion. But your role never really ends, does it?" Prince Philip studied her for a long moment, and Margaret worried she had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then his expression softened, and she realized he was grateful for the direct question. "You're quite right, my dear. The role never truly ends. Even in private moments, one is aware of representing something larger than oneself. The crown, the institution, the continuity of tradition." He paused, running his hand along the bar again. "But you ask about strength, and I think that's where our experiences might diverge somewhat from yours." He began to pace slowly, his movements measured and thoughtful. You see, when you're tired after a performance, you have the luxury of authentic exhaustion. You can feel it, acknowledge it, even celebrate it as evidence of having given your all. When I'm tired after a day of royal duties, the tiredness itself becomes another thing to manage, another aspect of my performance. Miss Clark tilted her head thoughtfully. Can you give us an example, Your Royal Highness? Certainly. Just last week, I attended 4 different events in one day. A university graduation, where I had to appear scholarly and inspiring. A veterans luncheon, where I needed to embody dignity and respect for service. A children's hospital visit, where my role was to bring joy and comfort. And finally, a state dinner, where I represented the formal traditions of the monarchy. Margaret tried to imagine transitioning between such different emotional requirements so rapidly. In dance, she might perform different pieces in a single recital, but they were usually connected thematically, part of a cohesive artistic vision. By the time I reached the state dinner, Prince Philip continued, I was not only physically tired, but emotionally drained from shifting between these different aspects of my public persona. Yet at dinner, when the conversation turned to how refreshed and energetic I looked, I had to smile and agree, perhaps even make a light joke about the advantages of royal living. Sarah shook her head in amazement. That sounds incredibly isolating, sir. It can be, Prince Philip admitted with a frankness that surprised them all. There are very few people with whom one can discuss the genuine challenges of royal life without seeming ungrateful for the privileges that come with the position. People assume that because we live in palaces and travel in private aircraft, we have no right to feel tired or overwhelmed. Margaret thought about her own complaints after difficult dance classes or challenging performances. At least she could share her frustrations with her fellow dancers, people who truly understood the specific demands of her chosen path. I suppose, Prince Philip continued, that's why I found myself drawn to your studio this morning. Here are people who understand the discipline of performance, the challenge of maintaining excellence under pressure, the way physical demands intersect with emotional expression. He looked around the room again, his gaze taking in the mirrors that reflected multiple versions of reality, the bars that supported countless hours of practice, the worn floor that bore witness to years of dedication and effort. There's something honest about this space, he said quietly. It's dedicated to the pursuit of beauty and excellence without pretense. No political agendas, no diplomatic implications, just human beings striving to perfect their art. Miss Clark stepped forward with a gentle smile. Your Royal Highness, might I suggest something? We often end our more challenging classes with a few minutes of simple movement, nothing structured or demanding, just a chance to let our bodies move naturally after intensive work. Prince Philip raised an eyebrow questioningly. Perhaps, she continued carefully, you might benefit from a few minutes of simply being present in your body, without the weight of representation or performance. Just gentle movement for the sake of movement itself. Margaret held her breath, wondering if Miss Clark had gone too far with this suggestion. But Prince Philip's face lit up with something that looked remarkably like relief. Do you mean to say I could just move without it meaning anything beyond the movement itself? He asked, and there was something almost childlike in his wonder at the possibility. Exactly that, sir. No one watching except those of us who understand that sometimes the most profound thing you can do is simply exist in your body, without purpose beyond presence. Prince Philip looked toward his security detail, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then he turned back to the group of dancers, and Margaret saw something shift in his posture, a subtle relaxation that suggested he was allowing himself to step, however briefly, out of his royal role. I think, he said slowly, that sounds like exactly what I need. Though I should warn you, I have no training in dance whatsoever. Miss Clark smiled warmly. Your Royal Highness, this isn't about training or technique. This is about giving yourself permission to simply be human for a few minutes. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. She was about to witness something unprecedented, a member of the royal family allowing himself to be vulnerable, to step outside the carefully constructed boundaries of his public persona, if only for a brief moment in a dance studio in London. Miss Clark moved to the sound system and selected a piece of music that Margaret had never heard before, something gentle and flowing without the rigid structure of classical ballet compositions. The melody seemed to float through the studio, creating an atmosphere of peace and possibility. "There are no rules for this," Miss Clark announced to the group. "No positions to perfect, no techniques to demonstrate. Simply allow your body to respond to the music in whatever way feels natural." Prince Philip stood motionless for a moment, and Margaret could see him processing this unusual invitation. His entire life had been governed by protocol and expectation, by the necessity of doing things correctly according to centuries of tradition. The concept of movement without purpose must have been both liberating and terrifying. Slowly, the other students began to move. Not the precise, controlled movements of their earlier combination, but something more organic and personal. Sarah swayed gently from side to side, her arms floating around her like she was swimming through the music. James closed his eyes and began a series of slow, rolling shoulder movements that seemed to release the tension Margaret hadn't even noticed he was carrying. Margaret herself felt uncertain about how to move without the structure she was accustomed to. But gradually, she began to let her spine curve and straighten in response to the melody, feeling each vertebra as it participated in the gentle wave-like motion. Prince Philip watched them for several bars of music, his expression curious and thoughtful. Then, almost imperceptibly, he began to shift his weight from one foot to the other, just the smallest acknowledgement of the rhythm that filled the room. "That's it," Miss Clark said softly, not directing her words to anyone in particular. "There's no wrong way to do this." Encouraged by her words, Prince Philip allowed his movements to grow slightly larger. He raised his arms slowly, as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra, then let them fall naturally to his sides. The gesture was simple, but Margaret could see something profound happening in his expression, a kind of wonder, as if he were rediscovering his own body after years of treating it as merely a vehicle for royal duty. "You know," Prince Philip said, his voice barely audible over the music, "I had forgotten what it felt like to move without purpose, without observers analyzing every gesture for political significance." Margaret noticed that his security detail had positioned themselves so they could still monitor the room while giving their charge as much privacy as possible for this unusual moment. Even they seemed to understand that something important was happening here. As the music continued, Prince Philip's movements became more confident. He began to walk slowly around the studio, not the measured pace of a royal procession, but the natural gait of someone simply enjoying the act of walking. His arms swung loosely at his sides, and Margaret was struck by how much younger he seemed when freed from the rigid posture required by protocol. "The remarkable thing," Prince Philip said, continuing to move as he spoke, "is how different my body feels when I'm not holding it in service to something else. Usually, my spine is straight because it represents dignity. My shoulders are set because they must carry the weight of expectation. My face is composed because it reflects the stability of the institution." He paused in his walking and experimentally rolled his shoulders, much as James had done. Margaret could almost see decades of tension releasing from his muscles. "But right now," he continued, "my shoulders are just shoulders. They can relax because they don't need to symbolize anything beyond their own existence." Sarah had moved closer to where Prince Philip was standing, not intruding on his space, but creating a sense of community through proximity. "Your Royal Highness," she said gently, "may I ask what this feels like for you?" Prince Philip considered her question while continuing his gentle movements. "Like remembering something I had forgotten I ever knew. When I was a very young man, before I understood what my life would become, I used to walk through the gardens at Balmoral just for the pleasure of walking. Not because I was going anywhere in particular, not because anyone was watching, just because it felt good to move my legs and feel my heart beating." He demonstrated this long-lost pleasure by taking several long strides across the studio floor, his face showing a kind of boyish delight that Margaret suspected few people had ever witnessed. That sense of physical joy, of movement for its own sake, I think I lost it gradually without realizing it was disappearing. Every step became calculated, purposeful, observed. I stopped noticing the simple pleasure of having a body that worked, that could carry me through the world. Miss Clark nodded understandingly. In dance, we sometimes talk about finding your way back to your body after injury or a long break from training. It sounds like you're experiencing something similar, rediscovering a relationship with yourself that was never truly lost, just temporarily forgotten. Prince Philip stopped moving and looked at her with obvious appreciation. Yes, that's exactly it. I've been performing the role of Prince Philip for so long that I had almost forgotten there was a person underneath all that performance. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she witnessed this moment of self-discovery. She realized she was seeing something that very few people would ever see, a powerful, influential man remembering his own humanity. The music began to fade, and gradually the spontaneous movements in the studio slowed to a stop. Prince Philip stood in the center of the room, his breathing slightly elevated, his posture more relaxed than it had been when he first entered. There was color in his cheeks and a light in his eyes that spoke to some internal renewal. "I feel," he said slowly, "as if I've just remembered something important about myself, something I didn't even realize I had lost." Margaret looked around at her fellow students and saw her own amazement reflected in their faces. They had expected to demonstrate their dance skills for a royal visitor. Instead, they had witnessed a profound moment of human reconnection and healing. "Your Royal Highness," Ms. Clark said with genuine warmth, "you're welcome in our studio anytime you feel the need to simply be yourself." Prince Philip smiled, and Margaret noticed it was different from the polished public smile she had seen in photographs. This smile was unguarded, grateful, and entirely authentic. "You know," he said, "I think I might just take you up on that offer. This morning I learned something important about the difference between performing for others and simply being present with oneself." He looked around the room one more time, his gaze taking in each student's face as if he wanted to remember this moment, and these people who had given him such an unexpected gift. As Prince Philip prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the studio had transformed completely from when he first arrived. What had begun as an unexpected interruption had evolved into something none of them would ever forget, a genuine human encounter that transcended the boundaries of rank and protocol. "Before I go," Prince Philip said, turning back to face the group of dancers, "I want you to know that you've given me something quite precious today. Not just the opportunity to move freely, but the reminder that beneath all our various performances, whether on stage or in public life, we're all simply human beings trying to navigate this world with grace and authenticity." Margaret felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the royal visitor, but to the entire concept of performance and its place in human experience. She realized that her struggle to find naturalness in her dancing was part of a much larger human challenge. The balance between meeting external expectations and remaining true to one's inner self. "Your Royal Highness," James spoke up, "what you've shared with us today about the challenges of constant performance, it's changed how I think about my own art. I've always focused on technical perfection, but now I understand better the importance of finding moments of authentic expression within the structure of performance." Prince Philip nodded approvingly. "Yes, exactly. The technique serves the expression, not the other way around. Whether you're executing a perfect pirouette or delivering a state address, the goal should be to communicate something genuine through the structure you've been given." Sarah raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, do you think you'll be able to take what you've experienced here back into your royal duties? Will it change how you approach your public role?" Prince Philip considered this carefully, his expression becoming more thoughtful. "I think it will, though perhaps in subtle ways that others might not notice. I suspect I'll be more aware of when I'm performing versus when I have opportunities to be genuinely present. And I'll certainly remember that even within the most structured roles, there can be moments of authentic connection." He gestured toward the mirrors that line the studio walls. These mirrors show us our reflection, but they also show us how others see us. Today, I've been reminded that there's value in both perspectives, being conscious of how we appear to others while also staying connected to our internal experience. Ms. Clark stepped forward with a small piece of paper in her hand. Your Royal Highness, I've written down our class schedule. Should you ever find yourself in need of another reminder of your essential humanity, you'll know where to find us. Prince Philip accepted the paper with obvious pleasure. Ms. Clark, I cannot adequately express how grateful I am for your spontaneous kindness today. And to all of you students, thank you for welcoming an unexpected visitor and sharing your sacred space with such generosity. Margaret found herself speaking before she fully realized she had decided to. Your Royal Highness, thank you for reminding us that what we do here matters beyond just our own artistic development. Understanding that our art connects to larger human experiences, it gives our work deeper meaning. Indeed, Prince Philip replied with warmth. Art has always served that function, helping us understand our shared humanity across all the artificial boundaries we create. Today, you've proven that a dance studio can be as powerful a place for human connection as any cathedral or concert hall. He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back one final time. I came here this morning feeling exhausted by the weight of constant performance. I'm leaving with the understanding that performance itself isn't the problem. It's losing sight of the authentic self underneath the performance that creates the burden. The security personnel stepped forward subtly, indicating that it was time for them to return to the scheduled demands of the royal calendar. But Prince Philip raised his hand for just one more moment. When people ask me about this day years from now, I won't tell them about the military parade or the charity meetings or even the hospital dedication, important as those events were. I'll tell them about the morning I learned to move without purpose in a dance studio in London, and how a group of generous young artists reminded an old performer that authenticity and duty can coexist. Margaret watched as Prince Philip walked toward the exit, his posture somehow incorporating both the dignity required by his position and the relaxed awareness he had rediscovered during their impromptu movement session. She realized she was witnessing someone who had successfully integrated two seemingly contradictory aspects of himself, the public figure and the private person. After he left, the studio fell silent for several minutes. The students looked at each other with expressions of amazement, as if they were all trying to process what had just occurred. Finally, Miss Clark spoke. Class, she said softly, I think we've just experienced something that will influence how we understand both dance and life for years to come. We've seen how art can serve not just as performance, but as a pathway back to authentic human experience. Margaret nodded, feeling fundamentally changed by the morning's events. She understood now that her struggle to find naturalness in her dancing wasn't a technical problem to be solved, but a lifelong journey of maintaining connection to her authentic self while meeting the demands of her art form. As the students began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave, Sarah turned to Margaret with shining eyes. Did that really just happen? Did we really just spend an hour helping Prince Philip remember how to be human? Margaret smiled, still processing the profound nature of their unexpected encounter. I think we helped each other remember something important about the relationship between performance and authenticity. And I think that lesson is going to stay with all of us for a very long time. Walking out of the studio that day, Margaret carried with her not just the memory of dancing for royalty, but the deeper understanding that true artistry comes from finding moments of genuine expression within whatever structure life provides. Whether that structure is a ballet combination, a royal protocol, or any of the countless roles people perform in their daily lives, the challenge and the opportunity remain the same: to bring authentic presence to whatever we're called to do. The morning that had begun as a routine dance class had become a masterclass in humanity, taught by an unexpected teacher who had reminded them all that beneath every performance, no matter how polished or important, there beats the heart of a human being seeking connection, understanding, and the simple joy of authentic movement through the world.